Thank you very much for your time. It's wonderful to have you here. Please welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I feel really privileged to do this.
Well, I know you, George, from the International Council of Psychologists. I know you are a psychologist. Please, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do there and where you are located?
Yeah. So right now I'm sitting in Shanghai, in China. I am an American clinical psychologist. Like you said, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in California and Hawaii. I'm from the United States, but for the past 7 years, my family and I have been living here in China, in Beijing for 3 years, and now in Shanghai. In Shanghai, I am the chief of mental health for an international hospital here called Shanghai United Family Pudong Hospital. I'm also the president of the Shanghai International Mental Health Association, and I've had the distinct privilege of working in the community in these capacities now for several years, and just really enjoying it.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that it's a lot of experience, and also not just the professional experience, but also the intercultural experience that you have. I think it gives you a different perspective of what is happening.
Yes, absolutely. Fascinating things that I'm sure we can get to. Yeah.
From your perspective, how China could deal in a very effective way to flatten the curve?
Yeah, so China here has been flattening the curve, and as you know, we have been dealing with this coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic since January of this year, and to one extent or the other, the entire country was affected, right? Obviously, some territories and municipalities were closer to epicenter areas and areas of greater rates of infection. And so some areas experienced very severe restrictions on movement and things like that, whereas others didn't. Some areas that were closer to the epicenters, some people couldn't even leave their homes, couldn't leave their high-rise apartment buildings, couldn't leave their compounds, things like that. Over here in Shanghai, we only experienced a more moderate set of restrictions, but we are just now coming out of this whole quarantine period, right? Shanghai just opened schools this past week, began to open schools for certain grade levels. Other parts of the country have been doing so gradually for certain grade levels over the course of the last few weeks. But yeah, it's early May here, and we have been dealing with this now for going on 4 months. But it is interesting. I think China was able to flatten the curve, with very, very decisive action. And we can go into why China was able to do this. Some of those are due to its system of government, right? Some of it is due to cultural factors that we can discuss. I believe, you and I have very similar, interests in sort of the impact of culture and the cultural factors that weigh in to human behavior and psychology. But yeah, I mean, China was, Wuhan, where sort of was the epicenter of this whole issue, and other parts of that province were locked down immediately, or very soon and very quickly and very totally, And so China was able to pretty quickly restrict movement of its citizens during a time that was very, very travel heavy. A lot of people don't know this, but the coronavirus began in mid-January, which is right at the beginning of what's called the Spring Festival here, or the Chinese New Year period, which is the single biggest holiday in all of China, right? And by single biggest holiday, it's sometimes the only holiday that certain people get, particularly the working class, right? They get really that one holiday, and it's long, which means everybody is taking advantage of that holiday to go see family, just as everybody does around the world during holidays. You go home to visit families. And because there's such a big migrant worker population here, there's a lot of people on planes, on trains, on the road, in cars, in buses, going home. And here comes this virus during the time where people are going through crowded airports and train stations and bus stations, and it's hard. But China really totally restricted movements between cities quickly. Totally set up a system where people with certain symptoms were triaged in a certain way, so that they could so that they could be funneled toward identified fever clinics, right? So as not to infect the rest of the hospital population. We can go on and on about how effective that was. We can go on and on about the specific problems there were in the operations and the implementations of it. But to some extent or the other, it was done. Wuhan famously built thousands of hospital beds in 10 days. And it's hard to picture that happening in many parts of the world, right? And so China was able to do some things that I think other places weren't really able to do or haven't been yet.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is one good point to talk about. How do you see, knowing a lot of countries and having this international position that you have, and living there in China, how do you compare the countries and how they are dealing with the pandemic?
Well, it's interesting. And again, some of it is due to a system of government and some of it is cultural, right?
Right.
In China, I think we all had to deal with the pandemic because we all had to deal with the pandemic, right? We had to deal with the pandemic, obviously, because its epicenter was here. But we also had to deal with the pandemic because, the government said we're going to do this, right? There's no option, right? We all mandatory, right? Enforced. You can't go anywhere. You can't travel. When you go outside, you have to wear a face mask. You may not even be able to go outside, depending on your risk category, right? And China began passing out face masks to 1.4 billion people, right? And controlling the movement of 1.4 billion people, which is a situation that not many other countries face. But on the flip side, so when you ask the question of why was China able to do this? I think, the other part of it is that the Chinese people, by and large, kind of saw the need to do it, or saw the need to just obey what was being told them, right? And there really wasn't an option, right? And it's sometimes hard to see that, or hard to picture that happening in some other parts of the world, where the government would take such quick action, such decisive and total action, and have it so readily accepted by the people whenever, especially when that action does impinge on, liberties, right? The freedom of travel, the freedom of going out, the freedom of leaving your home, all of this, it does impinge on these liberties. But by and large, it was accepted quite well by the people.
From this perspective, one could say, and I've been listening to these kinds of statements here in Brazil, and I think I heard people from other countries as well, saying that, well, maybe it could be better if we had also that kind of regime here in our country. And at what point would we understand these kinds of behaviors?
Yeah, I suppose, from a certain perspective, yes. A more totalitarian, if you will, regime has, I guess, certain benefits, like that during a pandemic, where people will just, I guess, do what they're told. But I don't think that's the entirety of the story. I really don't, and I feel that living here, that And I feel that growing up as a person of Asian descent, I was born and raised in the United States, right? But I was born and raised sort of in a culture that was more Asian. And there is a value in certain cultures, including many cultures in Asia, but not just Asia, many cultures also around the world and in other parts, of sort of a collective mentality, right?
Right.
That there isn't such a bright line between like my freedoms as a person and as an individual versus the needs of the society, right? And so the two are sort of more intertwined, right? And so an entity, whether that's a totalitarian government or whether that's a democratic government or whether that's a public health authority or whatever, an entity telling a person, hey, you should do this because the society needs you to do this, right? Like you should stay inside or you should wear a face mask because we're going through this right now and you're not sick, but we need everyone to do this, right? That message can be processed differently by people with different experiences, right?
Right.
So someone could say, oh, I see that even though that impinges on my civil liberties, even though that means I can't go to work or go to school or go out or socialize or whatever in the same way that I'm used to,
Right.
I kind of have to do it. I gotta do it. And I may have to sacrifice something myself to do it. I may have to sacrifice my convenience, my freedom, my joy and happiness to some extent, my whatever it is, right, that I have to sacrifice because we all have to hold up this tent.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Now, that could be processed by somebody else as like, oh, no, don't you tell me what to do, right? Because this wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything. I have the right to go to work. I have the right to, go out, go to the beach, whatever, right? Which is true. Right? I mean,
Right.
there is that right in many places. I mean, it's true, right? And it's true that it probably wasn't that person's fault. But I think that the message that, oh, there's something that we should do right now can be processed differently, right? Depending on the experiences that somebody's gone through.
Yeah. Well, I think you
Yeah.
touched the point that it's very important for us to say that is this collectively sense that we all should have. I mean, we are not alone in our own houses, in our own cities, in our own countries, and we have to
Yeah.
understand this social impact that our lives cause. And in this way, I think that some countries, maybe small countries compared to China and United States, Brazil, for example, and that they could also manage that, I think, from my perspective, in a good way, such as Switzerland and some small countries in Europe that maybe in their democratic regime, they understand better and they trust more the government. And if the specialists and the government are sincere, are united, so people can trust and people can say, well, I will stay home because it's better for me and for my community. And as I see here in Brazil, in the United States, and many other countries, there are a lot of mixed interests in government, in the media, in leadership. So it seems that each one of them pull to different places, and then the people are not very confident to trust them.
I think you're right. There's so many partisan or special interests, that have a role, particularly when they're more democratic, systems of government, where different segments of society have have voices and input. And not that like not that they don't have input here. It's just that what comes out as the messaging, because it's a single party system here in China, right? So what comes out as the messaging is one message, right? Whereas back at home in the United States, you could have the president, for example, putting out a message, but he is from a particular perspective, right? And then other people will put out another message from their perspective, even different parts of the government, right? Because there's independence really within the government too. And so like, there could be many different messages, and that could be potentially confusing to the citizenry, right? Where they're like, look, maybe, I'm somebody that I'm not, I'm a professional from a wholly different type of field. Like, I don't know, virology, or I don't know public health, or that's not what I do. I'm something else. And so I do need to sort of trust the voices from the authorities about what should I do? Why should I heed? I have an order, but maybe I'm somebody that needs to understand why that's, why that order is being given to me. And so I think it's incumbent upon governments to understand, like, look, this is what your citizenry needs, right? This is what they need in order to be able to swallow and digest what you're about to ask them to do, and this is a long-term goal, right? Yeah. This is not something that we could do as soon as a coronavirus hits. Like, that's already too late. Like, you don't have time to do that when during a pandemic, right? You have to get enough ICU beds, and you have to get enough ventilators, and you have to get enough like masks. And I mean, there's just too much other things to do. This is something that has to be built up, in the ethos of the nation, or, over time, and I think it's something, I think this is a wake-up call. This pandemic is a wake-up call in so many ways. But one of them is a wake-up call that, okay, we need to take a look at our systems of governance and see whether we can address the very real issues that are out there, the very real threats, which include this virus. And it's interesting because the United States has not been, we've seen, in the US, viruses, right? H1N1 hit our shores. SARS, maybe not as much, Ebola slightly, but we've seen some. But a lot of times, I think, we as people, and I don't mean just Americans, right? We fall into this fallacy. I think people in general fall into this fallacy of the other, right? Right. Like, something is happening to the other.
Exactly.
Oh, there was SARS in 2003, but that's happening over there, in China or wherever. Or there's Ebola, but that's happening over there. Or there is, whatever it was, avian flu, equine influenza, whatever it is, right? That's covering. It's happening elsewhere, and it's not going to affect us. Exactly. And I think that's a fallacy. Right? We don't live in that kind of world, at least not anymore. Mm-hmm. I think that when this virus, began to really take hold here in China, which was in mid-January, maybe even earlier, I think that, from that point, folks should have been saying, oh, that's going to come here sooner or later. To some extent, right? It's going to hit, and we should prepare.
Exactly. We are connected, and more than ever. And maybe we don't want to be connected because we have our own interests.
I'm afraid, I gotta say, I don't know what you think, Élison, but I am afraid that this pandemic will worsen sort of the nationalism that is kind of hitting many parts of the world.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I'm not going to make a political statement. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to, right?
Right.
So I'm not going to, but it's like, it has sort of hit many parts of the Western world. And I wonder what the long-term effects of this virus will be. Will people say, look, we shouldn't be as connected, right? It should be every man for himself, or every country for themselves, or it should be, right? Because connectedness is bad. Connectedness opens us up to threats. I don't know, right? I do know that fear is you and I both know that fear is a huge motivator.
Yes. That
fear begets fear, right? And fear negatively affects our cognitive processing, right?
Exactly.
And so when people act out of fear, they're not utilizing everything they have cognitively, right? And they're not right because it's this fight, flight, or freeze kind of reaction. And I think that is just the same socially or as a group as it is individually.
Yeah, yes, I totally agree with you. And I think that as psychologists, we should try to understand these behaviors of the societies, of the countries. And I think it's true that we are afraid of the different. And as we were growing in that globally sense of society, we were maybe these nationalism movements were kind of expressions of that fear that you were mentioning. And maybe
Yeah.
also what is happening is telling us again, well, you were not separated. There is no way back. Uh, Hundreds of people or
Yeah.
maybe thousands of people flew from China to New York during the virus. The virus only
Every day.
spread every day.
Not every day. Not just to New York. I mean, we have Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago. We can go on and on. Honolulu, right? We can go like on and on,
Yeah,
every single day. From Wuhan itself, there's several direct flights to the West Coast
yeah,
every day. And so like, I think too that this fear like results in this blaming. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think and your observations in Brazil as well. But like, I think, fear drives us to want someone to blame, right? We want someone to blame, and we want someone to blame because we think that blaming somebody else absolves ourselves,
exactly.
right? And like, if we can call it the Chinese virus, or if we can, I don't know, there's like this news now in the US that there's a state sort of suing the government of China. I mean, what is going to happen from that, right? Or, telling countries that they should pay because it's their fault and not our fault. And I get where it comes from, but I just feel like, you know, the energy that is spent on looking for someone to blame
Yeah,
really could be redirected to how can we come together? What is the message of this virus? Is the message of this virus, oh, we should all go back to our own countries and throw up walls and insulate ourselves? Or is the message of this virus, look, whether you like it or not, we are connected as a humanity,
exactly.
right? We are connected, and the walls and the borders and the whatever you want to throw up isn't like it's just not gonna work. The virus is not going to obey it. Right?
Exactly.
And because that's not sort of the natural order really of humanity, right?
Exactly.
And so to attempt to go against that natural order by sort of these sort of constructed and made up kind of things is really quite feeble, you know.
Yeah. And if we look at the specialists, the virologists, the epidemiologists, they were long time saying that our biggest threat are the viruses. And
It's gonna
despite
happen.
that, it's
Happen.
ironic because what most of our resources are invested in weapons, and we invest very little in health, in psychological health, in intercultural relationships. And I think these are some of the most important things that we should invest nowadays.
Agreed. Totally agreed. I mean, it's so much fear, right, in the world that causes us to do that. But I think too that you bring up a good point in the second part of your statement just now, that I think we talk about second and third waves of infections of the virus, but I really do think that subsequent what we're going to see when we all come out of this initial stage of the quarantine is we're going to see a lot of profound mental health impacts. I just read an article just yesterday that talked about how emergency rooms are seeing many more injuries related to child abuse after the quarantine began in those municipalities, because and we saw this here in China, right? Because most of China was quarantined since February, early February, and so much longer and earlier than most of the rest of the world, and has only just in the past few weeks began to sort of come out of it, depending on where you live. So but we saw so much. We saw obvious increases in anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, stress reactions. Some of these we expected because data, the psychological science has shown us from previous quarantines that were not as big, not as long, but we saw that, right? So we knew that. But we saw also a lot of decreased frustration tolerance, difficulties with emotion regulation, people losing their tempers, because the quarantines combined with the largest work from home, right, kind of like that the world has ever seen, the largest e-learning or internet-based learning, online learning, right, everything's closed, and all of this is happening at the same time. And people realize that they just don't have the mechanisms to cope with all of this,
Exactly.
And so the mental health ramifications, I think, on families, on societies, are gonna be coming later.
It's really good point. And it seems that the virus and the pandemic is just highlighting the problems that we already had, such as, for example, the increase of domestic violence and other problems. As we were concerning before the pandemic, the high number of depression, the increasing of depression in everywhere, and suicide. I mean, here in Brazil, the numbers were increasing. There is a lot of things that we could talk about, and it would be wonderful that we could talk more in other times as well. But for now, what else would you like to say? Would you like to leave a message? Is there anything that you would like to share?
I would. We were talking so much about this scary stuff, right? And the problems have not ended. They're going to come back, and there's going to be mental health problems down the line. And I think all of that is probably true. However, I will say that I read an interesting study just a few days ago that studied several hundred school children in Wuhan, that were under quarantine. And they found, not unexpectedly, that a significant percentage, a much higher than expected percentage of those children suffered from depression symptoms. Now, but they also saw that the children who didn't suffer from depressive symptoms had an outlook that was much more optimistic regarding the pandemic. They had healthier coping mechanisms. They had more cognitive flexibility, right? They had a different outlook and a different mindset. And I think that that is the key, that we all have the opportunity now, right? Although we're dealing with something very, very scary. And this is in no way to minimize the fact that many, many people are dying throughout the world, right? And so many people have to deal with their health first and the health of their loved ones and their family members, and that's completely expected. That's completely fine. It's just that I think for many of us, we are not necessarily directly affected, but we can make choices in our lives, right? To view things from different perspectives, to say, what can I learn? How can I grow? How can I grow from this experience of this pandemic? How can I positively affect the lives of the people around me? In my neighborhoods, in my family, in our families, in our communities, right? What can we do? And I think that the more we can turn our eyes to those things, the more we may be protected from some of the negative mental health sequelae that might come of it.
Right.
And that might hold true both individually as well as collectively.
That is perfect. I think you can we can quote Viktor Frankl when he says that life has meaning under any circumstances. So this is it. If we have a better perspective, even in these difficult times, we can deal better with the problems, with the issues. And I think this study is showing exactly that.
Totally agree with you.
Well, thank you very much, George. It was a wonderful talk,
Absolutely.
and I think you had a lot of good things to tell us.
Thank you, Élison. It's my pleasure.